Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining us. We're going to go ahead and jump in and get started. I know people are still arriving as we're getting going. I'm sharing my screen. I just want to make sure that folks can see it. Yes. Okay. If you haven't met me before, I'm Dan Linna. I'm the Director of Law and Technology Initiatives and a Senior Lecturer here at Northwestern. And welcome to AI and the Future of Lawyering and Law Firms. We have a great set of speakers today: Steve Poor, Mari Sako, and Hyejin Youn, and I'll give them proper introductions in just a couple of minutes. Want to tell you that we are trying something new. We've been using Google Docs and different ways to generate conversation in these events. We're using Slido now, and you can join if you have the code. You can go to Slido and use the NULTI code, or you can use the QR code on the screen as well here, or you can. Alex is going to drop a link here in the chat, and you can just click and go straight to Slido. But we want to encourage you to get engaged in the conversation there. Our impression is that a lot of these webinars, people are like multitasking and doing a lot of things. We want to try to make this as engaging as possible. Put some questions there, reply to some questions, upvote them, and we'll use those for our discussion with the panelists. Just wanted to briefly tell you a little bit about the Law and Technology Initiative here at Northwestern. It's a truly interdisciplinary program. It's a partnership between Pritzker School of Law and Computer Science. We work with roboticists and other people in engineering and other people across campus as well. And then with external partners, including in our innovation lab where we work on projects. We have computer science and law students and master science law students working in interdisciplinary teams to build prototype technology solutions. And then we also have these monthly meetings, academic conferences, training workshops. We're doing research, and we have a variety of classes around these topics. Technology for law, like AI and legal reasoning, and also law of AI, law of robotics classes in the law school and in the engineering school. We have a conference and a academic symposium next week on Friday, February 5th. Some of you may have registered already. Law and Computation, an Algorithm for the Rule of Law and Justice. If you haven't already registered, I'd ask you to consider registering. We have a really great lineup of speakers, computer scientists and legal scholars, and we're really excited about the opportunities for interdisciplinary research in this space. And we have a group of international speakers for that program, just like we do for today's program. Want to thank the students who support the Law and Technology Initiative: Sharon Mims, Alex Crowley, Hiba Sheikh, Hitch Thompson, Katie Nagley, and Chandler Keller. And so student participation and engagement is really important to this program moving forward at Northwestern. And we want to thank our many collaborators and supporters, including LKQ Corporation for their gift, their financial gift to support the Law and Technology Initiative. So today's agenda: this is the welcome and intro, brief intro. And then we're going to get into, each presenter is going to give a 7 to 8 minute presentation, just kind of a TED Talk style sort of brief intro, Ignite style presentation. Then the other two panelists will have a few minutes to ask some questions of that person. We'll kind of go through in order. We'll be watching Slido. I will be as we do that. But then we're going to have open Q&A after that for the final 40 minutes. And again, we want to make this as engaging as possible. Please drop questions in the Slido. Read the other questions. Let's have a discussion there and on these important topics. So get engaged there. Another place to get engaged is on Twitter. Our program Twitter handle, NLawBizTech. And anything you post, Twitter, LinkedIn, Facebook, please use the NLawCS hashtag. That's the best way for us to find it, NLawCS in social media. Okay, so our panelists, we have Steve Poor. Steve's a partner and the chair emeritus at Seyfarth, and he led the law firm through its lean revolution and is now focused on client-facing technology strategy, which includes robotics, AI, and cognitive computing. Steve began his career at Seyfarth as an employment lawyer with particular depth in trial work and ERISA litigation. Then we have Mari Sako joining us from the UK. She's a professor of management studies at the University of Oxford, Saïd Business School. And Mari's main areas of expertise include global strategy, comparative institutional analysis, outsourcing and offshoring, and professional services. And her most recent work has focused on business and professional services and on outsourcing. And then Hyejin Youn, who's my colleague here at Northwestern. She's an assistant professor of management and organization at Kellogg School of Management and a core faculty member at NICO, the Northwestern Institute on Complex Systems. She's also a Royal Society of Arts Fellow and an external fellow at London Mathematical Laboratory. Hyejin received her PhD in physics from the Korea Advanced Institute of Science and Technology, and her research interests are to understand the interplay between technological innovation and socioeconomic systems. So we have a great set of panelists today, and we're going to talk about AI and the future of lawyering and law firms. And I'm really excited to have this group of panelists who are doing really excellent research in this space. And also, in Steve's case, engaged in the practice implementing AI into legal services delivery. Well, we see that AI is transforming the future of work. It has the potential to automate and augment many tasks. It's also creating new jobs to be done and new roles. And so what we're asking, and we're particularly interested, given that we're an institution of higher education and a law school, how is AI going to impact the work of lawyers, legal professionals, and law firms? So our panelists are going to discuss the future of work, the work of lawyers and structure of law firms, and current uses of AI for legal services today. So with that, what I'm going to do is I'm going to stop sharing my screen. Our speakers in order will be Hyejin Youn, Mari Sako, and Steve Poor. And again, just remind you, join into the conversation on Slido. We'll be watching that for the Q&A that we're going to be doing, especially for the last 40-minute portion. So please get engaged there. And let me stop sharing and turn things over to Hyejin Youn.
Thank you. Let me just share my screen. Okay. Do you see my screen? Okay.
Yes.
So thank you for a great. Yes, thank you. Thank you for a great introduction. And I'm so excited to have this opportunity to meet people outside of my field. I'm probably the most outsider among the group because as Daniel just introduced me, that my background is physics and all the way to the PhD. So, and then I moved to business school. Then I'll explain why, and actually, which is associated with the topic I'm going to present, future of work. So yeah, like so I study in the section of AI and big data science in the context of business and industry. So for that reason, my perspective, not particularly in legal workforce, but more in general, like systematic approach and data-driven decisions, data-driven organizational problems. So just give you some context that I never ever actually never have spoken with a lawyer. So this is my first time. I'm so excited. So yeah. So okay. So when I was thinking of a legal work in the context of AI, then I realized it's not only just future work in terms of the producing something with AI or using AI, but also in the context of the working for AI, which is a little bit more murky for me. So I just leave it as a food for thought for you guys to think about further. So first of all, I'll just start with legal work with AI. So future work, like general future work. As you all know, technological unemployment. We have new technology and it was great. And then it boosts the productivity with the complementarity. And then we need less and less, because individual becomes more productive, we need less and less of the workforce. For example, this is agriculture, workforce in agriculture. Now we don't see many farmers in the field. not only that, like, it's not only the, if you look at the logistics, now a lot of things are automated, and the manufacturing as well. It's a well-known, like, feature. And that is the reason why we were fear about the jobless. But as I said, like, this is not kind of new. It used to be like this, like in the beginning of the industrial revolution, we had Luddite, and like, famously, and also there was a concern about technological unemployment, and then recently, it's not recent anymore, like 7 years ago, there was a big impact paper by Frey and Osman to calculate how much how automatable each industry or each job occupation. And there is a site, you may want to just check with that. I was a fellow at Oxford when this came up, and I was curious about my job security, like in response to this automation. So I just looked at the list of the jobs that are least at risk and the most at risk, as you can see that in the, like, Google search. So I typed my future work, my job, physical scientist, and it's 20%. It's not too bad. And then I look at the business professionals, management professionals. It's a 7%, so it's actually way better. So maybe it's better to move to the business school. So I actually went to business school as a faculty member now. Then I was asked this talk, and I was curious about this legal professions, and I went there and then see the 3%. So you guys are safe. So be assured. However, the question is it really true that the legal industry is really, really safe from AI impact? The thing is, like, there is a nuance, and the world is complex. It's not just the dichotomy and like yes and no, and also it has a web of the human resource. So if you look at the individual workforce, they share the skills and education somewhat to some extent. So for example, here is paralegals. It's not really far away from human resource specialists, and there is another way to look at this system, that now we have an AI, or in general, like technological advances that can complement and also substitute some of the skills and tasks. And that will make it more complicated in terms of the labor market in general, and whether the labor force is more removable or less removable as a whole system in as you can see in what is this called, in regions, different regions, and also like different people and the task and skills. And also with the invention of new technology, for example, computer vision can affect not only just vision skills that affect not only just one person, one occupation, but also like series of different occupations. And also skills and tasks are also interact each other, so that the system can be fragile as a whole. So this is like kind of like a thing we have to understand, rather than just looking at just the legal service, legal workforce, but in general, like how systems in industry and the like higher up level of the industry, how this transition of one work and demand and force affect
Hyejin, oh, I think you froze there for just a second, Hyejin, but hopefully we're getting you back. Okay, well, this is one of the risks of online events, that sometimes the technology doesn't work exactly as expected. Well, so what we plan to do is to ask some follow-up questions of Hyejin, but given that she seems to have frozen, what we will do here is stop her sharing. And hopefully that works. There we go. And hopefully we'll get Hyejin back in just a moment. But in the meantime, Mari, why don't we turn things over to you, and we'll have you do your presentation, and then we can kind of pick things up with a little bit of Q&A when we get Hyejin back and give her a minute to wrap up anything in her presentation.
Great. So of course I can do that, and I'll be happy to pick up where Hyejin's left, as it were. So firstly, thank you so much for the invitation to this gathering. And it's amazing how 200 plus people from around the world, indeed, seriously, are here gathered, and definitely one of the advantages of a Zoom mediated conversation. What I'm going to do is to really kind of back up what Hyejin was trying to convey, but within a legal context, and very much based on work that I've been doing with my Oxford colleagues, some of whom are in the audience: John Narmer in law school, Richard Parnham, my colleague at Saïd Business School. There's some economists and computer scientists in the program, and our program is called Unlocking the Potential of AI in English Law, but I'm sure that there are some commonalities beyond English law. So in the next few minutes, very much like to kind of share with you some snippets of what we've been doing, which is, social science research around work. And the first thing to really kind of think about the impact of AI is to not take the unit of analysis of the job or the occupation, but to break it down into tasks. And here's this lovely quotation from Richard Susskind, who was talking about the ways in which, end of lawyers, he says question mark, of course, but, likely to be fading in prominence, much as blacksmiths, tallow chandlers, mercers, and many trades became redundant in their day. This is one level of analysis, but what we are interested in is to think about what lawyers do in terms of different tasks, and to think about different impacts. One of which is, of course, AI replaces humans in some tasks, typically repetitive and scalable, but equally important is the augmentation part of it. So AI augments what lawyers do, what lawyers as consumers of AI, really focusing on what they're really good at doing, best at doing, giving bespoke advice to clients. And then AI also is augmented by lawyers. So these are kind of lawyers, legal technologists, legal product architects. There's lots and lots of different job titles emerging who are part of the production line, if you like, of AI. And in order to do this latter task, we found through interviews and surveys that new tasks are being created to support the lawyer's work. And they could be new to the industry, legal industry, like project and process management and information security, and the importance of user interface and user experience. And it could be quite new to the world as well, like the role of AI ethics. And these different experts together working with lawyers, typically in the multidisciplinary team environment. So just to kind of repeat what AI does in terms of substitution, it's the repetitive, scalable text-based tasks which are being replaced. But equally important, AI augments what lawyers do, and then AI is augmented by lawyers working in multidisciplinary teams as well. So in this context, it seems that it's very important to look at where are these multidisciplinary teams, or MDTs, and we found through a survey of English solicitors, about 350 of them, we carried this out last year this time, that lawyers and law firms are less likely to be working in MDTs than lawyers working in corporate legal departments. We also found that AI deployment is associated with lawyers working in these multidisciplinary teams as well. Of course, that's a correlation, not a causation, but I think that gives you some background to suggesting at least that having a good operational MDTs is a facilitator to effective AI deployment. Okay, and I think that in industry and in academia particularly, when we think about corporate governance and thinking about the challenges of traditional law firms, partnerships, we tend to think of the main challenge in adopting AI to do with the absence of financial external capital that could go into innovation and legal tech. But what we found was that through the interviews again, that the challenge is not so much about financial investment constraints, but very much a human capital constraint as well. And so what we heard in our studies very much around the difficulty, or at least the challenge of really recruiting, promoting and retaining top level data scientists and project managers and other non-lawyers, if you like, working in multidisciplinary teams within a law firm context. I know that this can be done, but I think there are challenges, not least because of the traditional career path progression for non-lawyers. So we know that for a lawyer, you typically can progress from being a junior associate to senior associate and partner and become an equity partner as well. That kind of opportunity at the top is not available to the tech and the management career path. As a result, they come and go, or they go and set up their own alternative legal service provider or a legal tech provider operation as well. So with that in mind, I think this is my kind of penultimate last slide, thinking about the future of the legal profession in relation to what lawyers do in the future and how law firms might look like. I see the possibility of three possible futures. I'm not saying that one is more likely than another. I think at this particular stage, these are equally likely, in my view, or plausible. So the first is, if you like, pretty much business as usual. Licensed lawyers are the main human capital, and then they will be assisted by some specialists in data and data science and project and process management. In the middle, I think, is the rise of lawyer coders, so that people who actually do some of the technical work, including AI development, will be part of the legal profession. To the right is a completely different scenario where the legal profession will splinter, so that people who are going to be entering into legal operations and legal technology may not all be necessarily entering via the licensing of legal profession route. Okay, so I think it's really important to kind of think about what we can to influence the future if you have a preference for one or the other. And I think that's really up to us in the legal profession to do that. Okay, so I think the time is up, and so I just want to kind of conclude by key takeaways. I hope that this follows very nicely. I hope to Steve Paul's talk, which is really based on practice. But as a researcher, I think I want to emphasize that AI automates tasks, not jobs, and that lawyers can be really effective as a consumer of AI as much as a producer of AI. And that multidisciplinary teams are really important in that context. And we found the emphasis on human capital rather than financial constraint as being a really important area to pay more attention. Thank you.
Thank you, Mari. I really love the emphasis, this idea that thinking what we want the profession, what we want legal services, legal systems to look like in the future, that we have some agency in deciding kind of where things go. So we lost Hyejin, but I think what we should do is let's do the follow-up questions for Mari, and then we can go back to Hyejin to wrap up her presentation. And so we kind of decided that we would go in order and of the speakers to ask follow-up questions. So Steve, I'll let you go next to ask some follow-up questions, and then we'll go to Hyejin.
Okay, thanks, Dan. Great presentation, Mari. Thank you. I'm curious, in your research, in the UK a number of years ago, they changed the restrictions on ownership limited to lawyers. And I'm curious as to whether your research included organizations that had not moved down that path, those who had moved down the path, and whether you found any differentiation in your studies between, and if you did you find any differentiation in your studies between those different types of organizations?
Yeah, so thank you, Steve. I think you're referring to the 2007 Legal Services Act that allowed lawyers and non-lawyers to co-own and co-manage law firms. And interestingly enough, there are now about 900 of those so-called ABSs, alternative business structures, which are licensed by the SRA, Services Regulation Authority. Many of them, however, are not in corporate legal services, but in the kind of more retail consumer legal services area. And so my study have really been, partly because of being in the business school, focused on corporate legal services and rather than consumer area. So I haven't really done a very systematic study of the challenges that these ABSs face right now. But I think that, the fact that they can actually promote and retain non-lawyer staff means that they are in a much better position. And one firm that I would want to mention is DWF, which is an English law firm that is publicly listed. They've been a PLC for about 2 years now. So watch that space in one way, but I think they have an interesting corporate structure that has a holding company, and then law firm is actually a subsidiary of a holding company with other operations as well. And I think that might be the way to go, where you basically have an operation that doesn't just do legal services, but the ways in which you scope out the market could be different in insurance or in whatever the kind of one-stop shop consumer facing solutions might look like.
Did you get any input from your studies? I'm focused now on your pyramid, the progression opportunities for people. In your corporate law firms, was there any input from them as to whether the ABS structure provides an opportunity for them to solve the problem you've identified about the inability to progress into partnership by some of these additional allied professionals? Do you see that as a trend, or is it really going to be limited to consumer legal services?
So again, I think that ABSs are primarily in consumer legal services, but that the opportunity for non-legal management and technical experts to rise to the top, I think is already seen. Again, the DWF chief executive is a non-lawyer. But the peculiar, absence of the Magic Circle and other large global law firms to adopt this particular form, alternative business structure, struck me as something that's worthwhile thinking about. And why is it that Linklaters, Clifford Chance, and Freshfields are not going for an ABS structure? And I think the answer is to do with the fact that they are really focused on bespoke legal services, where much of their human capital and talent and the reputation that goes with that are focused on that. And they can always buy as well as make, but primarily also think about buying the legal technology platforms that they need to use to deliver the services. So as I made a distinction between lawyers as consumers of AI and lawyers as producers of AI. And I think that whilst you can do both equally well, that's quite challenging. And I think firms might be choosing to prioritize one rather than the other. And I would say that Magic Circle firms perhaps are focusing on being consumers, lawyers as consumers of AI. I hope that's kind of making sense, but I'd love to understand more about what you're doing and thinking in your firm as well.
Thanks, Mari.
So Hyejin, we'll give you a chance to ask any follow-up questions on Mari's presentation before you pick yours up again.
Of course. So what's the time frame when you are talking about the augmenting lawyers? And of course, like there must be some time frame, because at the end of the day, we it could be different that within 10 years, within 100 years, within 1,000 years, there must be some kind of time frame you're thinking of.
So all the kind of future of work debate is kind of absent in that kind of timeline. I guess partly because we are not futurologists, but also because much of the academic study, at least is focused on looking at occupations which are at risk of automation. And actually, there's a great difference between thinking theoretically about those jobs which are at risk, as opposed to actually going to be automated. And those actually being automated, I think, has to come with a number of complementary changes that has to happen, some of which is to do with organizational structure, and some of which is to do with corporate governance and access to external capital. And maybe there are kind of attitudinal and cultural aspects as well. So I think that it's really difficult to think about, how those different factors come together, because it is really an orchestration of different factors coming together via complementary forces. And so I would say that, and as Dan was commenting earlier, there is quite a lot of agency, I think, on the part of the legal profession and the policymakers to make these things happen. So I'm definitely not going to be in a business of predicting the future and how many years it would take. Other people, I think there's probably quite a few people who want to do that anyway, so I don't have to join the bandwagon, I don't think.
Hyejin, would you like to, so we lost you at the last bit of your presentation, and I'd welcome you to give you an opportunity to.
Okay, so, all right. So maybe like the last part was a little bit more, so up to this part, it is more concrete in terms of a framework. And it is like, the Mary's point of, it's an overarching of the Mary's point of view that it's augmenting, and also so at the level of task and skills, some of them subset of task and skills can be substitutable, but as a whole, as an occupation, it could be complementary. That it would augment the lowers. Legal workforce. But there is another dimension I just want to just put out there. It's not like really concrete work, that how this business is changing. And if you're a representative for the business, then you may want to think about in a little bit like further down the road, that a lot of business now is the essence of the kind of agency in some sense. The Uber, for example, these are the 5 different companies, 6 different companies that didn't exist like 20 or 30 years ago now. And all these like businesses are quite peculiar in the sense that Uber doesn't have the vehicle, Airbnb doesn't have their own real estate, Facebook doesn't have kind of content, Instagram doesn't have the camera, Netflix doesn't have the cable. So those kind of like things that is now it's beyond that. Am I? Okay, so it's beyond that, that now there are so many things that are virtual, like money doesn't exist in physical form, no workers in the factory, no drivers in the car, no cashiers in the store. So all things now is changing, not only just like business
Well, this is one of the challenges of online events. Okay, it looks like we've lost Hyejin again. So let's go ahead and so hopefully we'll get her back, and we can give her a chance just to conclude, and we can ask.
Working.
Oh. Yeah, I think so. Steve, why don't we go ahead and pick things up with your presentation? And
sorry, I'm back.
Oh, are you back again? Okay.
Yes, I'm using the phone wireless, so it's I'm sorry. Somehow it never happened, but this was first time. Sorry.
Yeah, well, that seems to always happen when you least expect it.
Yeah.
Why don't I give you just a minute to conclude, Hyejin?
Oh yes, of course. Yes. So basically, I mean, I don't know where it was. So I just want to just open up this discussion, maybe not today, maybe not tomorrow, but in the further down the road, like when you are doing your own work, like think about what the future of not only just working with AI now, but also like what's the like essence of legal of the work in the presence of the business or the agency that doesn't actually have the traditional form. So thank you very much.
Great. Thank you, Hyejin. And so let's bring Mari and Steve into the conversation. And we agreed that Mari, you were going to start with a question for Hyejin.
Yeah, so from your sort of mathematical and kind of physics background, I wondered what kind of challenges you face on a more kind of technological front in thinking about application of AI in different fields. And my limited understanding of legal is that it's text-based. A lot of the things are language that is quite specialized as well, and lay non-lawyers actual description of the legal problem might be quite different from how a lawyer or a judge would describe. Is that kind of issue a live and exciting area for data scientists to get into, or is it just one of many different areas that people are investigating?
I would say it's one of the many different areas that people are interested in the data science. But the one thing I encountered as a challenge is that when I look at the work in different contexts, the work can be described, like we have this description of the work, like what kind of task and skills, what kind of technology are needed for this work to be done. But many of the things, the real like details of things are not captured in this documentation, which is often called the tacit knowledge. And capturing tacit knowledge is not really, really easy. I mean, that's why that's why Mary, your work is very valuable, because as a data scientist, who don't know the context, who don't know how to capture this tacit knowledge without actually working together, without interviewing, just like having just the titles and the installation, for example, communication. What do I mean by communication? What kind of details of communication needed, and what kind of context is needed? It's not really captured in data science. The people of data science is that whenever you measure, the data scientist needs data, but data requires a lot of choices to make to capture what kind of the features you want to capture in your data. And that requires context, and also even if you know what features you want to capture in your data set, a lot of things are not really even capturable because it's a tacit knowledge. People sometimes know more than they can describe. And that is one of the challenges, that the data science may not be able to predict the future, even if we have a great data, large scale data, and great mathematical model to capture and compute and predictions. But at the end of the day, it is based on the choices that were hidden in the process of collecting data. So just want to put a full disclosure that you may not want to fully believe the data scientists the conclusion, because I mean, even as a lawyer, so you may know that your assistants may not be able to capture or do whatever you're told to do because they are not trained. And what do you mean by training? So there are so many things you have to jump to a hoop.
Great, fascinating. Thank you, Michael Polani, live and kicking. Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting question, is just how much of legal work that involves tacit knowledge. And Steve has a lot of background on applying process improvement and capturing information in process maps, things like that. There's more of a movement of thinking about how do we standardize things, how do we actually become more evidence-based in what lawyers do, which kind of starts moving towards figuring out what actually can be captured and what is more tacit and more difficult to capture. But Steve, a follow-up question for Hyejin?
Yeah, Hyejin, I'm curious. I want to pick back up on sort of themes that both you and Mari have hit, which and to sort of pick up a little bit on your prior answer. Because I agree with the analysis in terms of automation in the legal profession hinges there's a distinction I make between the provision of legal advice and the provision of legal services. And those are related but different things, and it requires you to pull the tasks apart as opposed to just saying lawyers have a 10% chance of being automated. Well, certain of the tasks lawyers do have a very small chance of being automated, but certain of the tasks in the provision of legal services have a much higher because they're repetitive, they're more structured data, for example, and perhaps unstructured data. And I'm curious if whether you're aware of any ongoing studies, sort of to the point you were making, trying to pull those pieces apart in the legal profession to sort of look at it on a broader task-based analysis rather than just a broad occupational study.
I think I will have to delegate this answer to Mary, because I mean, full disclosure, I never actually worked on the legal specific case. So it's more in general that so my tool can be too crude to capture or answer to your question. So I will just leave the Mary to answer.
Yeah, I think a lot of the study is very much looking at task description in data sets like ONET, which is what Oxford colleagues Frayne Osborne did. I think that Frank Levy and Diane Ramos at MIT have also looked at similar sources as well. And so much of the effort is looking at tasks which are at risk. By looking at what it is difficult for machines to do, which are things like emotional intelligence and things of that sort. Yeah. So.
Okay. Thanks.
Great. Well, thank you. And so let's step to the next presentation. So Steve, we'll turn things over to you. And there have been a lot of great questions on Slido. We will especially focus on those after we get through the next presentation and some Q&A. And so there's some great questions there.
Thanks, Dan. I'm the non-academic in the group, so it's a little intimidating being with my two colleagues, frankly. But what I'm going to talk about is sort of how our journey has evolved in the practical application of some of these technologies to the practice of law, what we've learned, what the change drivers are, and a couple of examples of how we've implemented what's sort of loosely referred to as AI, although we rarely use that term. First, just a little context, because as Mari and Hyejin have pointed out, context is king here for us. First, with regard to Seyfarth, where I've spent my career, it's a multi-national firm, 17 offices worldwide, about 900 lawyers, full scope of services. So our laboratory is broad and wide and multidisciplinary in terms of trying to understand how we can apply technology. To give you a little context for my background, I think Dan set it up a little bit. For 15 years, I was chair of the firm while we embarked upon the journey I'm going to talk about in a minute. For the last few years, after stepping out of that role, I've been one of the folks leading our tech R&D function, which we refer to as Seyfarth Labs, where our task, and there's about 15 or 16 of us, is experimenting with emerging technologies and applying them to the practice and to our client relationships. So I'll talk a little bit about our journey, again, in terms of context, because it informs how we think about the world and how we set up our description of technology and technology applications. We started our journey back in 2005, give or take a little bit, out of a desire to understand if there's a better way to structure the delivery of legal advice and legal services. We started with Six Sigma. We then brought in Lean techniques into that. We then combined them into Lean Six Sigma with a fair amount of experimentation. Resulted in us creating one of the first legal project management offices and doing a lot of process work underlying it, because what we found was that we needed to understand the task involved in the provision of legal advice and legal services and the end-to-end process involved in order to begin to look at how it was put together and how it was structured. There are moments in any legal project where it requires flashes of intuition, flashes of magic, so to speak. But there are lots of pieces that are repetitious and can be routinized and structured in a way to be more efficient. And that's what we learned for the first few years. We then began, as the journey continued, to begin to overlay technology on top of this process and project management. And I emphasize the project and process management because that task analysis and that process mindset gave us a unique foundation to begin to think about how technology fit. For the last few years, that in turn has reached a co-creation with clients, our own research and development functions. We've done a lot of work in legal operations, and the marketing folks always like me to talk about applied innovation, which I'm not going to talk about. But it's created for us a toolkit for as we think about how we deliver services. And it's really a combination of factors: process and process analytics, technology, which can be collaboration, data analytics, automation techniques, AI, and of course our team. And Mari and Hyejin both talked about multidisciplinary teams, and I'm going to talk a little bit more about that here in a minute as well. But none of these toolkits help, and the application of technology doesn't help if you're not able to drive change and get people to use the technology and adapt their way of working to a different way and a different tool set. So I think it's useful just to take a moment to think about the forces driving change and the forces driving stasis in the legal profession, because you can't sort of understand the implications of AI and the implications of working differently unless you begin to understand the forces aligned for both sides. And I could spend hours on any one of these particular components, and I'm not going to, but you'll see on the right-hand side, forces driving change from technologies to globalization, to increasing multidisciplinary practices, to a new generation of buyers and sellers, which are still counteracted by an inherent resistance to change by lawyers, a belief in the bespoke nature of the practice, the human capital nature of the business. But one thing I do want to spend just a second on is on the bottom part, the new entrants into the market, because I think it fits into what Mari was talking about in particular. Because one of the trends we've seen over the last few years, and it's continuing to accelerate in the pandemic, is the entry of new organizations and new viewpoints into the market, into the provision of legal services. The big four, which have a huge amount of capital and goals in the legal industry, tech providers, legal ops professionals, hybrid solutions. You can see them on the slide. And what's important about this is a point that Mari talked about, which is that these are organizations that largely are multidisciplinary skill sets. So if you think about law firms, traditionally law firms thought about themselves as lawyers. We have lawyers, that's what we do. And our connection with our organizations, our clients, are through the legal department. And maybe sometimes, depending on your area of practice, maybe human resources and maybe management. But it was a singular focus that didn't broaden out to all of the other components that clients have and all the other disciplines that are important to the operation of our clients. So what that meant was that for most law firms, we're structured with lawyers. If you think about the big four, for example, they have all of these additional skill sets that they are used to bringing to bear to provide problem solutions for their clients, which is the trend you need to see in the legal profession. So our journey has taught us certain lessons based on this and with the entry of new people into the market and with new technologies. First, you need to have a strategy for how you're going to develop and deploy new technologies. The technology itself is not a strategy. It's a tool for implementing what you want to accomplish as an organization. And you have to focus on the people. And I know this is a presentation on technology and all the cool stuff computers can do, but I hearken back to what Mari said, which is technology augmenting the skill sets of people and people augmenting technology. It's the way they mesh that's critical to what we've learned. Tech can't fix everything. It can do some really cool stuff. And one of the things to think about, and one of the things we've learned as we've tried to implement new technologies, is to always be in beta. Fail fast and adapt, reduce your risk, because lawyers are looking for risk. Lawyers look forward by looking backward. And so you need to minimize the risk and continue to build on your success. So our experience has been that built off of our culture and core values, we bring talent, and these are some of the categories of people. They're different components. I'm using Seyfarth lingo, and I apologize for that. Our teams are multidisciplinary, between technologists, between developers, between process analytics, and of course, process and technology. So I'm going to give you an example of how we've begun to put together some of these technologies that are over the last few years. These are not things that are in the hopper. We could pick a number of examples where we're about to announce a very cool custom designed application on top of the Salesforce platform to redesign a big segment of our practice, about a $50 million segment of the practice. But we also apply technologies in as small as using expert systems to create automated intake provisions and self-service platforms and chatbots and sort of everything in between. This is an example of some of the combination of technologies that we've used to try to automate what's become now a fairly normalized application of technology in the legal industry for the review of documents. And the combination, this is again an example of what Mari was talking about the augmentation and the combination between people and technology. So this is what we call Seyfarth cognition, because what would a product be without a name? Because goodness, how else would you refer to it? What you're looking at is basically a workflow diagram. So it's taking, in this case, this example is taking contracts and creating, sorting it and putting in information to speed the review by lawyers. There's similar ones for complaints in lawsuits to accomplish the same result. What's happening here, and you see the little diagrams, the little robots, those are our robotic process automation robots that are moving information from structured data to other structured data. This happens to be the engine, the inference engine tends to, here it happens to be iManage Extract. Seyfarth Link is our collaboration platform. Neota Logic is our expert system, and Dundas BI is our data visualization. So this is a combination of technologies, because what we find is that there's rarely one technology that serves the particular purpose that we're looking for because of the nature of the practice of law. Again, if you think about it in terms of tasks, normally here you would have a bunch of documents that lawyers or paraprofessionals would go through and begin to pull out key information and sort it and put it in information. And then somebody would look at it for the particular issue the client is looking for. An example of that in this case is we had a client that was changing its corporate structure and had thousands, it was an investment company, had thousands of investment contracts, and was concerned that the change in ownership structure would trigger obligations under these thousands of contracts. Now, in the normal way of doing that, you would have had, as I said, lawyers going through and looking for the right phrases and the right clauses and take hundreds of hours to do it for what's a fairly routinized process. What we did, and use this system, they were able to go through and sort through the contracts, eliminate certain contracts that were governed by certain laws outside of the country from consideration immediately, sort the relevant subset, put the information into context, sort it, and then begin to produce it in a summary. So what happened at the end of this was, rather than looking at it with something like 5,000 contracts, the lawyers had to look at about 200 clauses. So it reduced the time of the lawyers and the efficacy, and increased the efficacy of the lawyers significantly to produce a faster and cheaper result for the client with a higher degree of accuracy. Dan, I've lost track of time here. I think I'm about at my closer. Do I have another minute or two?
Sure. If you want 1 minute to wrap up, that'd be awesome.
Yeah, I think picking up on the themes, what we've learned is that what you've heard from Mary and Hyejin is applicable in today's practice. There are technologies, there are automation techniques that, if you think about it in terms of tasks, if you think about it in terms of what's important for the provision of legal services, and you work in a multidisciplinary practice, you can utilize technologies to achieve really interesting results in today's environment, let alone the Ubers of the world coming down the road to the profession. So with that, Dan, I'll turn it back over to you.
Great. Thanks, Steve. One of the many things I like about this example you have here is we often view AI as a monolith, some monolithic thing. And then there's also this debate between different types of technology, machine learning, rules-driven systems. And you have a nice example here. These systems involve a lot of different types of technology, pulling them together. So let's go back to our panelists for questions that we discussed. And Hyejin, I'll let you go first.
Excellent presentation. I really like to, I was fascinated by what's going on inside of law firm in action. So, but one thing I've been curious about is that you consider it's a technology in a status quo form, the current form of the technology that only can do what you're told to do. But now, we are moving into artificial intelligence using this deep learning, which sometimes we don't understand what was this decision, what was the reason to make this particular decision the machine made. And also, it introduced this scale at which it can produce things as a decision is pretty large, which may generate some kind of algorithmic decision, generated some sampling, some kind of bias. So for example, this decision making, the interview and hiring someone from this automated machine learning algorithm, and then introduces some kind of human bias as well. The machine actually resembles a human bias, and which is just one example of many possibility that we were not able to detect. We were not able to detect yet. That there must be some algorithmic thing that we never thought of, implemented in this program that we trust. So how do you estimate that kind of unwanted consequences?
Oh, that's a great question, and I think you do have to recognize that lawyers, as they're making decisions, are influenced by their own experience and their own bias, not necessarily a legal bias, but bias based on their own experiential. And so we begin to think about it in terms, there's so much fertile ground for the application of technology that you're leaping to a solution set that is not going to be readily acceptable into the legal profession for a while. And the reason for that is not just the elements you're talking about, which is the difficulty in quantifying and categorizing the decision making in the variables. And there's a piece of it, if you think computers are going to replace lawyers, one doesn't understand what lawyers do. But lawyers are resistant to technology and the perceived application of technology to what they do if it hits them in a big way. And so what you have to do is you have to begin to think about, this goes back to process and it goes back to the analysis of the structure. How are you getting from point A to point B? If you begin to pull that out, what you find is that there are moments, as you're describing, where there's where intuition, inference, those innately human characteristics are coming into play, and you're not going to be able to automate those. But many steps of the process can be structured in a way that allows you to pull up more data. So if you think about it, the goal isn't to replace lawyers. The goal is to automate tasks and to automate parts of the process to enhance the efficiency of lawyers.
I mean, that's excellent. I just, but like one thing, I mean, okay, one thing I'm worried about is that the current, the advance of the AI is now entering to the cognitive, the decision making, also capturing the human instinct as well. So through the machine learning, so machine resembles the deep learning, the neural net, and they learn things as if a child learns the world, and then like they make a decision as if a human make a decision, resembling the insight, the human insight and gut feeling. So I don't know that, like that's why I think it's important to think about like time frame. Like no, I don't think it will happen in, I don't know, maybe not in my generation, but it's yeah, it's a gray area.
Yeah, listen, if it's not going to happen in your generation, it's certainly not going to happen in mine.
Yes.
But maybe rephrasing Hyejin's question, I know, Steve, you made a distinction between legal advice on the one hand and legal service on the other. And I wonder to what extent, you know, the days back in 2005 when you're really focusing on the business of law and increasing efficiency with Lean Six Sigma and all that. And now with AI, which I think does impinge on the legal advisory, the kind of practice of law in a much more front office way. Does that distinction between business of law and practice of law going to be blurred as we move on to a much more AI world?
I think it's always a little blurry where they meet. I think what you'll see is that line shift over time as more work becomes routinized or the technology evolves to a place where it's able to handle more and more complex tasks. So I think you'll see a shift. I don't think the distinction will go away, but I think what is considered the true delivery of legal advice in terms of those innately human characteristics will continue to shift into a smaller bucket as technology allows you to encode what's going on in people's brains a little bit more.
Right. Yeah, and fantastic. So many questions I'd like to ask, but if I may just slip in one more about multidisciplinary teams. Yeah. So I'm going to turn around the question you asked me with that pyramid. How are you promoting and retaining your staff in Seyfarth Lab or elsewhere who are not lawyers within your organization? You said that there are 900 attorneys. I don't know how many non-attorneys are employed by your firm.
We've got about 1,500 allied professionals in a variety of components. I mean, it's a big business, so you've got finance people and IT people and all that kind of stuff. And you know, we struggle with the dynamic that you referenced in your piece. I mean, I think for the R&D function, we've been able to keep people because the fellow who runs it day to day, my colleague Byung Kim, is able to create a great team environment and create interesting work to do, and we've got the support of the firm and the recognition that comes from that to support doing some things that are unique in the legal industry. We've got practice management and process people that are, you know, we create an environment in which they're able to succeed. It's not just about moving into partnership, but certainly I think, and I asked the question about the ABS structure because I've wondered about that myself as to whether that's a tool that would give firms, they look at it as a way to get outside capital into the business. And I've wondered for a while as to whether there's a different way to look at it, which is you not necessarily need outside capital, but you need the ability to move people, the point you made, the ability to move people up into the organization, and whether an ABS structure, which is not really is not viable yet in the States. So,
Right.
but
So the top voted up question actually on the board kind of gets at some of these ethical issues around lawyers' use of AI. And the question is about whether lawyers can ethically represent their clients if they're not using AI. I think we can already point to an area where that could arguably be the case, and that would be the use of AI for technology-assisted review. So Steve, you're a litigator, I was a litigator. It's become quite commonplace now to use these technology tools. If you charge a client for human lawyers to review large amounts of document, particularly if you didn't get their consent to do that, good chance someone's going to say that'd be an ethical violation. Could you think of, you think there are other areas where we're going to see where you just can't ethically provide advice if you're not using these tools to augment the work that you're doing as the lawyer?
yeah, listen, I think that's a great point. If you're testing my recollection, but I believe there's a model rule out there that talks about the obligation of lawyers to stay up with technology and to stay up with the application of technology. And so there's an obligation to understand there isn't any lawyer that doesn't use a word processing program now and still writes with a quill pen, if you think about it. But I think that particularly as you begin to see, you're beginning to see more and more studies would demonstrate that the error rate of using technologies, for example, in computer-assisted review of documents in discovery or looking at it for due diligence standpoint, has a lower error rate than human review. And I think you will begin to see over time questions about those people that choose not to do it. Can they ethically make that decision? It's an evolving area, but it's a great question.
Mhm.
So I'll ask Mari. I think that's an interesting question too. Like, what are you seeing? Because this gets also, I think, to the question of there was a large group of lawyers seem to think that alternative legal service providers and others would have difficulty getting traction because of this prohibition on them delivering legal services. But we've seen them be able to capture more and more work that looks less and less like legal advice giving as the market matures and we understand the structure of work better.
Yeah, I think alternative legal service providers, including law companies in the Big Four, it's quite a mixed bag of providers. So we probably need to focus on one type, like the law companies. And I think that they basically provide services both directly to in-house legal departments and law firms, but they need law firms still. And so I know that some of the law companies have created their own in-house law firms as well. Again, I think this kind of harks on some of the things that Steve touched on and the importance of thinking about what lawyers do, which is giving bespoke legal advice. And I think even the law companies are kind of thinking that as a package to be really effective in legal service delivery, you need that wing of legal advisory as part of their kind of in-house expertise. So whilst they may be, much more flexible in being able to retain and create non-lawyer, lawyer, multidisciplinary teams, that there are some, disadvantages of being an ALSP that they're trying to kind of complement. So I think law firm partnership, with ALSPs, I think it's going to be mutually beneficial in some way. There's some technology basis for it, but I think it's also to do with capturing the right kind of client base on both sides. So there's quite a lot of collaboration and partnerships about which, it's not a kind of legally formalized partnership, but I think the nature of the partnership as it evolves is a competition, partly competition, partly cooperation. I think it's a really interesting area to kind of look at in terms of what happens in the future, where some people might be really aggressive and think that law firms are going to be disintermediated completely, and the law companies, the ALSPs will take over, but I don't think that's the case.
Hyejin, what might we be able to learn from other areas about this, about kind of like maybe even how policy can help drive the change, the positive change we want to see. I mean, we're talking about policies right now to some extent that insulated lawyers from adopting technology, but thinking that it might turn on its head that they're actually required to adopt technology. But if we're really thinking about the future, like you were talking about, and thinking that we have agency to kind of create the future that we want to have, what sort of policies, what can we learn from other industries like that we should maybe be thinking about in law, do you think?
So two things I could think of. One is the augmentation and complementarity can increase the productivity, like, increase the individual productivity that actually reduce the demand in the future. So for example, if you look at the ATM machine, introduction of ATM machine actually was the contrast to the worry that time, increases demand for bank teller. The thing is, bank teller, what bank teller has to do has changed with the introduction of the ATM machine, because in the past, the bank teller had to just exchange money, like all this routinized one. But after that, like, because we have ATM machine who does that job better, so now bank teller does more introducing some new products and they're like, building relation with the servicer, the consumers. So their job, even though under the same job title, their job tasks are just to transform, the change over time. And then if you look at the employment rate, introduction of ATM actually increased because of demand for changes due to the change of the jobs increases. So the number of job bank teller increases with the introduction of the ATM, and then like after a while it just suddenly decreased as well. So augmentation, like, it's again, like it's about the time frame that we are talking about. Maybe in the beginning it's increasing because now, like, with the new field and new complementarity, but I don't know what will happen in the future unless we change our task and our workforce. And also the second point is that it's not only just the job we have to do, like as a legal workforce or whichever industry, because the demand itself is changed, like kind of demands may change. Like as I showed you, business itself is transforming to the more technology oriented and algorithmic oriented, and then now you have to deal with the algorithm rather than like people's dispute. So now it becomes a kind of trickier to yes, that's how I can answer to you.
Yeah. Well, no, I think that's a great point. I think lawyers maybe tend to view things as a fixed pie. And if there's tasks that are lost, that there might not be something to gain. More forward-thinking organizations and lawyers and other legal services professionals are thinking about all the people who are going without, businesses that are going without, all the other opportunities to provide new types of value. Another question that got a lot of upvotes was, Mari, I know you mentioned something about this idea as lawyers as coders. And there's kind of a debate about this in the industry about, well, should lawyers be learning how to code? And like, is that actually a good use of their time? I tend to think it actually is, not necessarily having deep expertise in that space, but there are plenty of people who disagree with me that they think even spending a weekend learning Python isn't worth it. But what do you say?
Sure. So I think, legal services ecosystem have different entities. So there's the corporate legal departments, there is the law firms themselves, there are these alternative providers, they're tech providers. And in each of these workplaces, I think that there is a space for, people who might have entered the profession as lawyers who are really good at coding as well. But I don't believe that that is the majority. And that what's required of lawyers to be able to work effectively in multidisciplinary teams is not the fact that they actually know a lot of, programming themselves, but the fact that they actually speak the same kind of language, that they can probably explain whatever is tacitly understood, as Hyejin was saying earlier, in a way that is understood by people with different professional training and expertise. So it's that kind of relational mental framework that I think is more important. But there's also a regulatory restriction in certain parts of the world, including the US, where maybe that's the only way to have lawyer coders to actually develop AI technology in-house, if that's what law firms want to do. And so I think that depending on different jurisdiction, I would project that in a jurisdiction like the US, if the regulation is not going to change, there'll be more demand for lawyer coders in the US than in a jurisdiction like the United Kingdom.
Steve, what are you seeing play out in the marketplace?
Yeah, I think a couple of sort of things play off Hyejin and Mari. First, pick up on sort of Mari's point, which is I agree that there's a value to having people who are experts in coders or developers. They need to understand the legal business. They need to understand. I mean, for example, we have some people that are viewed as sort of interpreters between the lawyers and the developers, who can kind of speak both languages so that you can translate from one to another. I think that looking at it from an in-house or an internal law firm perspective, having everybody be a coder, to me, runs the risk of having the multiple different variations of the same solution set. It drives against the coordination of efforts and trying to standardize things. So it's important to understand how developers think and what technology works. I don't think it's that important to be able to actually, recode in Python, for example. The other point, picking up on something Hyejin said, which is that the other way you have to look at this is we look at it in terms of, oh my goodness, what's going to happen to lawyers? Are the robots coming for us? What's going to happen to law firms? I think that mindset, the firms that are advanced are going to be looking at what's important to our clients. Where do they need us to be? How do we continue to add value and answer that question? That will drive you towards the application of technology. It'll drive you to a more efficient way of doing it. Worry less about, what that's going to drive in terms, be nimble in terms of adapting your organization to what the needs are of the clients. But it's at the end of the day, what the clients need and what the opportunities are that should drive your own market, as opposed to some stasis or fear of what that's going to happen. Because the firms that understand that and are able to adapt to client needs are going to be the ones that are going to be successful going forward.
Hyejin, I'm kind of curious what you think from an outsider of the legal industry. We're both part of AI at NU, and we have several colleagues from the medical school who are medical doctors who are developing deep expertise in machine learning and using it in their medical practices. I see more of that happening in medicine than I do in law. I mean, maybe medicine's an outlier and law won't have as much deep expertise like by the actual lawyers, or, I mean, any other places we could look to maybe learn what might happen or what should happen in law?
Research would be more closer than the medical industry, because medical industry is better to be codified. The knowledge that are required for medical industry may be better to be codified. So, there is a machine that can judge whether the image of the lung is infected or not, the lung cancer, decide the lung cancer, that kind of things that we thought it was a human decision. Now it's getting to the machine's decision. But the law, it requires, I believe, I don't know much, but it requires more than the image. It requires interaction of humans. It requires the context. It requires all this, the senses that have to be made, and I think that it requires more feature space than what is needed in the medical industry and other industries. So that's one thing I could say. But no, when it comes to coder, I don't think that not every lawyer needs to know how to code. It just needs to know how to speak to the coder. And also, I mean, there is only few people we need to make a coders, and the program, the outcome of the codings is way scalable, which means just one or two can do a lot of different things, especially with this deep learning, which can be applicable to many different situations. So I don't think learning code is the, I mean, you can do that, it's fun. I mean, to be honest, it's fun. So just, you can do it as your hobby, but I don't think it's much necessary.
Mari, we've got a couple questions here about changing the narrative. That the narrative tends to be about taking away jobs to transforming jobs. And we see that everywhere, but this one was specifically about law firms. I guess I was wondering if in your research, have you been seeing any sort of best practices emerge? What sorts of organizations have been able to get the people inside the law firms or law companies even to really think about applying AI in this space and just really changing their mindset?
I think AI is obviously at an early stage. There's quite a lot of hype about it, but through the survey that I mentioned, through the Law Society of England and Wales, the uptake of AI, we defined it in a particular way as both rule-based expert system and machine learning, is quite limited. So I think it's firstly, in terms of the diffusion and adoption, we are kind of really at the beginning of the S-curve in a way, I think. So that's one thing to say, but ultimately there's quite a lot of appetite for looking at innovation per se, and I guess technology, AI included, are kind of bundled into that. So I'm curious about Steve's mention of applied innovation and what's actually meant by innovation in that context. But I think there's quite a lot of buzz around, looking at innovation with technology in partnership with tech providers. And I think, thinking about what kind of partnerships to develop and how to make the risk, manageable in relation to contracting with external tech providers, whether they're startups, which are really focused on legal technology, or whether giants like Thomson Reuters or even Microsoft. I think that's the kind of thing that I think some of the companies are giving a lot more regard to than others, in my view. Generally it's early days. I think it's really difficult to say. But again, I would focus very much on not so much the financial constraints of investing in technology, but on the human capital side, which I think some of the companies, I guess, because of the regulatory differences, are thinking more flexibly around what they could do. And I think the alternative providers, law companies, are much more practiced in doing that. So some of the interviews that we did with them, there are some very interesting human capital practices around how to kind of promote and think about associated professionals and professionals who happen to be lawyers but are not practicing.
Yeah. So, well, and Mari, some of your work talks about organizational structure, but I'd like to ask Steve about this as well, because I think the people who understand how law firms work understand the difficulty of, you may be the CEO, but getting everyone aligned and getting the different partners who may have a book of business and may not be interested in what you're talking about. I mean, how do you get people to think more about the opportunities and the need to do the work in this space and think about how to innovate for the long term?
Look, it's a constant exercise in change management, and all of the tools that come into the discipline of change management come into bear. Understanding your audience, having consistent messages from leadership of the organization, being able to show success, being able to show where you failed, how you've corrected for that, and how you moved on, having voices of clients come. All of those tool sets are important. And the other thing that's important is to understand is that it's a never-ending process. There's not only is there turnover within an organization, in any organization, but there's a consistent tendency that humans have to fall back to what's comfortable for them. In the world of Six Sigma, it's the C in DMAIC, right? The control piece. And so it's a constant recognition that you need to take a step forward, half a step back, another step forward, another half a step back, and that you're not going to step up in a law firm and have the CEO or the chair or whoever announce their great idea and have everybody go, okay, that's fine. That's not the way the business works. And so it's about building champions. It's about building all of those change processes that you need to get people to think differently.
Yeah, well, it'll be certainly very interesting to see how things play out. I mean, as Mari suggested, we may be at the beginning kind of the S curve here as things are starting to change. And there's certainly some firms in the market that we've seen for a while who have been taking a different approach to delivering services. And our firms like yours, Steve, that have been thinking about people and process part of this and then starting to use technology, are they better positioned to when change starts to happen more rapidly? it'll be interesting to see how things unfold.
I hope so. That's
Well,
the goal.
so we agreed we would give each of you a minute for some closing thoughts, and we'll go in the order of the presentation. But Hyejin, could you just give us a minute to share your closing thoughts?
Oh, this is a great opportunity for me to understand the legal workforce and how this can differ from the existing the industries that existing studies of industry. So this is like, I think it is a starting point for me to understand, like, study on this issue further down the road. So this is great. Thanks.
Thank you so much for joining us, Hyejin. I think, like a lot of disciplines in law, we have our own inside baseball and tend to be siloed sometimes. So I'm just thrilled that you were willing to come join us. And we have a lot to learn from the work that you're doing and that people are doing outside of the legal industry. So thank you so much. Mari.
Yeah, thank you, Dan, and thank you very much for kind of bringing us together, really. And that in itself is an amazing forum that you created to be able to converse across, different academic disciplines, but also between academics and practice. And one of the ways in which I think I'm going to kind of think about the future is very much around, what policymakers are thinking as much as what the practice people are doing as well. And across the Atlantic, I think it's really quite educational to think about, what are the drivers for those changes with, law tech. I think there's always a kind of comparison made with fintech that suffered and were in a crisis mode in 2008 and 9. And legal has never had that kind of crisis. So maybe, that's another reason why we're not fastly moving, but I look to the policy space as much as the practice space to think about the future and the speed of change in the future.
Yeah. And I just loved your message too before about thinking about what the future ought to look like and recognizing that we have agency and thinking about the things we can do, the policies we ought to have. So thank you so much for joining us, Mari, from across the pond. I know you're getting into the evening there pretty well already. So thank you so much. Steve.
Yeah, I'll just wrap up. It's been a great opportunity to listen to you folks. Thank you for your insights, particularly those drawn from both external surveys and external to the legal industry. I think the industry's got a lot to learn from what's going on in industries in general. If I were to just sort of summarize things from our perspective, is that the legal industry poses unique challenges, and it's easy to get discouraged over the perceived slow pace of change. But there are also great opportunities, and there's, for those people willing to continue to push a different way of thinking, a different way of finding problem solution sets, there's great opportunity out there. And I think you're going to continue to see both different movers in the market and people within law firms themselves continue to pick up the pace of change. There's cool things on the horizon, and I look forward to seeing what they are.
Yes. Well, thank you, Steve, for joining us. Really appreciate it. These are exciting times, in my opinion, as well. I mean, there's just so much happening, and it's so exciting too to see that these are international issues. We had a really great representation from really around the world for this program this evening, and that's great to see. Bringing people together, learning across all these jurisdictions, learning about what's going on in law firms, legal departments, alternative legal service providers, but also courts and on the ground in legal aid around the world. So many opportunities. So Alex Crowley dropped the post-event survey in the chat. Please complete the survey. We'd love to know how this went, how we can do it better, practicing a little bit of continuous improvement ourselves. We hope that the Slido app worked for questions. There were a lot of questions there. I'm sorry we didn't get through more of them, but we got through a few, and I saw some conversation and replies there. So that is great. And just a warm round of applause for Hyejin Youn, Mari Sako, and Steve Poor. Thank you so much for joining us. We really appreciate it. I hope many of you will join us for our Law Plus Computation Academic Symposium on February 5th and 6th. We shared the links for those earlier, and there they are in the chat again. So please register, please join us. And we look forward to continuing the conversation. Online is different than in person. We'll do some things in person again when we can, but we're really glad to have this opportunity to bring people together from around the world online and have this conversation. So thank you again. And everyone take care. We look forward to seeing you again soon. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you. God bless you.
Bye.